Book impressions, der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, a novel by Robert Musil. I just finished the book. Actually, I didn't read the whole book, and I've been talking about the book quite a bit. The reason I'm doing this now in English is because I'm done with the book discussion and all the impressions that I had. And I just want to add one more version in English because more of a contemporary reflection of the book. Because I think it's a really important book, I wanted to share this also with my English audience. It's not even one podcast. It's November 25th, 2025. This is Krim Delco. For the year, we're up 10%. The market's up 15%. We're underperforming by 5%. So, Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, The Man Without Qualities by Robert Musil. By the way, the translation, qualities versus Eigenschaften, it's pretty, it just shows that translations are difficult. And I'm really blessed to be able to read this in the original. So for anybody who has the possibility to read this in the original, read it in German. It's much, much, much better. And Musil is a true artist with words. So it's a beautiful, my favorite German author is Thomas Mann. I think Musil is in that league, if maybe artistically even better. But that's a different story. So there's two things I want to talk about that the book, in my opinion, has a lot of relevance for. And so one is the question of the rational versus the soul, or what Musil describes in his description of modernity as the rational colonizing the soul. There's something that's absolutely crucial today. I think there's no question about that. The rationality, particularly in Silicon Valley, is overwhelming. You have kids studying everything STEM in high school. I think our colleges are dominated by STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. So these types of subjects are considered the real deal versus the others, the humanities, the letters and sciences, as Berkeley calls it, are more second tier. Now, I think that that is absolutely nonsense, but the problem is not that we don't need literature and history and arts and things like that. It's the problem, in my opinion, is that the academic side of things has let us down. Academia has actually, misappropriated the humanities for its own sake, for its own benefit, like any other organization, like any other entity in nature. It took the resources that it was given, and it started proliferating itself in whatever benefited itself. And what benefits the humanities today is two things. One is they are educating a class of for lack of a better word, left-wing fanatics who then go work for government or NGOs and keep feeding the beast with absolutely nonsense ideologically. And second, it also it's related to particularly my profession. I was trained as an economist. My profession is totally misguided. Economics today is just a propaganda machine for the Federal Reserve and the Wall Street money system. It has no bearing for anything useful or scientific or whatever. It just feeds itself. So therefore, what I would say is, in the critique Musil had on the modernity, which is 100 years ago, is still valid today. We have the rationale, we have STEM, and that's something that's pretty unnegotiable, right? You can't, as much ideology as you want, you cannot change math, you cannot change engineering. You can prohibit math like they try to do in California. You can prohibit engineering. You can make it difficult for people to buy computers like we're doing with China, but you can't change it. Like it's us against nature. Like you can't change nature. I mean, some people try, the communists tried, the woke fanatics here in the US try, but it's very difficult and it's a losing battle. So having said that, now, my point is we are still in this conversation, and particularly because we are actually on the brink of developing intelligence, and we are asking ourselves some of the most fascinating, in my opinion, most important questions of generations, which is, what is a human? What is consciousness? What's the difference between the machine and the human? All these questions are coming up because we are building machines that are replicating the cognitive abilities of humans. So as opposed to machines that were built at the time Musil wrote his novel, which was machines that replicated the physical, the thermodynamics, and the physical abilities of humans, and that was not considered a threat to humans, or nobody asked themselves, well, if a shovel can shovel, or a forklift can lift more than a man, what's the purpose of a man? I think we kind of got over that. Or in World War I and II, machines and airplanes took over and dominated the battlefield. I don't think people were necessarily asking themselves, what's the purpose of man in a world like that? But today, we are asking ourselves that question, and I think it's a legitimate question. It's a very interesting question because it just puts, every time you hit some breakthrough in AI, every time a model can do something amazingly well, you ask yourself, well, why is it able to do it? What does this mean for humans? What's the purpose of humans in a world like that? So those are interesting questions. And I think the answer to that is, well, let's say it's not clear. It's really not clear. What does it mean? If Grok can give me a good description of der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, it does a really good job in analyzing the novel. It does a really good job in inspiring me to think about it. So why do I still need a professor for literature, or a person that has spent 20 years studying literature and German literature and all that stuff and modernity? Those are legitimate questions. What's the role of a human? What's the role of creativity? Maybe like that's one way to rephrase the question, and maybe also give an implicit answer, which is, well, I guess what's left here is the possibility. And it's a big theme in the beginning of the novel, which is we are, and back to Musil, he distinguishes between the realm of the possible versus the realm of the actual, of the truth, of what is, what's possible and what is. Those are two different things, and certainly inspired by the nascent quantum physics that started around the time when Musil started writing. Actually started before that, but he started writing this in the 1920s. So we're, it's about the time of the Solvay conference, which is sort of the official, the end of the beginning of quantum physics. My point here is, what does it mean, possibilities versus actuals versus factuals? It means that we're transitioning as a society from fixed norms, from good and bad and black and white and right and left, towards possibilities, towards literally, even like in quantum mechanics, the position of a particle is defined by all the possible positions that it could have, and its amplitudes, the probabilities of those waves that define the particle, and then the combination of all the amplitudes together puts it in okay, it's most likely in this position versus that position. And that doesn't just apply to particles. That applies to everything. That applies to ideas. That applies to somebody's life. That applies to somebody's choice of a spouse. The possible versus the actual. Like possible, in other words, yeah, you could be gay. You could marry somebody from a different race. You could, marry, two people, maybe sequentially, or even at the same time. I mean, why? What are norms actually? Well, why do we have all these norms? Those are questions that Musil brings up, particularly in the latter part of the book, when he talks about the psych ward, and the psych ward is the place where normal people don't live. But then what does it mean to be normal? And this distinction is useful. I mean, there's a use in norms, right? The norms are memes that have a function in society. They replicate themselves, they survive. And but I want to get back to the beginning of this conversation about the humanities. I think it's incredibly important that the humanities develop their own attitude towards what it means to be human. I think because we're in a new age now. The humanities of today, the old school humanities, they dealt with the fact that we're getting away from scholastic, church-driven ideas of human versus divinity. So we wanted to develop a humanity, humanistic idea, what is human and things like that. I think we have to change that today, because in light of what's coming with AI, both embodied AI and digital AI, we have to find ways to define humanity in a more contemporary way. And I think we don't want to fall in the trap of what Ulrich, the protagonist in the Man Without Qualities, I think we don't want to fall in the trap that we want to define humanities with a rational approach that the STEM field is very good at. So we want to find different ways. Now, what that is, that's of course the big question, but one way to deal with it is to introduce the possibility into the soul. So we just say, okay, like something along the lines of a crypto protocol, and I know that sounds very rational, but just bear with me for a second, because we leave the potential outcomes open, but we have a certain way to define them so that we can go on. We can, because otherwise, we're threading a fine line ever since the modernity started, ever since the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. We have the problem of relativistic nightmare. A relativistic nightmare is what happened in the Soviet Union. It's what the woke people and what COVID became, which is anything goes. It doesn't matter as long as I have the say. The people, the worshippers of Fauci, Anthony Fauci, they decided what COVID is. They decided how dangerous it is. They decided what needs to be done. Every other voice was shut down, called dangerous and things like that. And then we have Soviet Union rewriting history. We have people, let's say Google, try to rewrite history with Gemini. Now they've learned to do better on that front, but still. So we have these endeavors all the time with people trying to define what is true and what isn't, because we left that very rigid and, quite frankly, ossifying religious definition of what's right and wrong, which survived for 2,000 years, but was replaced by relativistic nonsense. So what I think is probably the right way to attack this problem of possibility versus actuality is what Elon Musk calls try to maximize the ability to find truth, which is how he defines the mission of Grok. That is, can we find ways to be more true than other ways? And I actually spoke with people who work at X, and the way they want to do this is by having some sort of voting mechanism, use different AIs, their own, but also others, to vote on things. So you could potentially algorithmize truth by having sort of a majority vote. Like, there is actually a real, these are real engineering problems that need to be solved. For example, when SpaceX flies, even now, but particularly at some point when they fly to Mars, they will lose contact to Earth, at least for minutes, because of speed of light and things like that. And therefore, there has to be a way to make on-the-fly decisions, and there has to be a way to decide what's the right decision. So the way they do this, to my knowledge, is they have actually a voting mechanism. So they have, let's say, redundant computers, and they better be, uneven numbers of them. So let's say there's 3, and as long as two say turn left and one says turn right, you turn left. So you have this ability to make a decision and decide what is true in a real context here, when a trajectory of a rocket needs to be defined, and one little mistake could basically cost the mission. So the same way, we on Earth, when we deal with our own personal lives or societal, or problems like you would encounter in the humanities, small decisions can have a big deal. Like, should we have a Federal Reserve or not? That was a decision that was combated in the 19-teens, and unfortunately, the decision was made to have it. And I think this is, in my opinion, is the downfall of Western capitalism, the monetary system, and all of these things. Now we'll look up with something better, probably Bitcoin or something similar, but nevertheless, I think those kinds of decisions, little decisions, having somebody like Anthony Fauci run the NIH and let them go wild and distribute billions and billions of dollars to academia, and therefore basically buying academia and totally undoing the actual usefulness of academia. All these things, these are small decisions, they have big impact. So we have to find better ways to decide what is the soul, what is our humanity, what is our society. And I think Musil points that out. He is offering some solutions. The man without qualities, Ulrich, is a rational man who has the ability to transcend rationality and actually incorporate the soul and not let it be colonized by pure math and rationality. So the second thing I want to talk about is related to this, and this is the question of truth and the question of why is it important? What's the value of truth? So this goes back to, again, in the novel, Nietzsche comes up a lot, and Musil was influenced by Nietzsche to the extent that he brings him in here quite prominently. I think it's also an interesting question that we encounter a lot in AI research. Like, we have the people, like say the world model people versus the continuous learning people, Richard Sutton, and then we have world model people, particularly in China. World models are very popular. So what does that all mean? Like, how can we train? Let's just put the question of truth into an engineering context. How can you train a robot to do most likely the right thing at the right time? And I don't mean the right thing in a sort of ethical way, but just in a functional way. How can you train a car to drive and pursue a goal which is congruent with what humans would pursue? Take you from A to B at a low cost, with high fidelity and confidence and things like that. Well, you can either have the car drive in sort of an AlphaGo zero way and try and error until it figures out how to do it with a useful, functional reinforcement learning algorithm, or you can have a world model where you can do that in the virtual world. I think, again, the concept of truth and what is a true world model then? What is a model that reflects the truth? People in academia talk about reflecting world models, grounding them in the real world, and then using Gen AI, which is grounded in the real world and generates trajectories. These are all engineering solutions to the same question. Okay, how can we ground something, an artificial or let's call it something that humans created, something that humans designed, that is meant to train another thing, an embodied intelligence, to actually move around in nature without having to move around in nature. You can do that in this virtual world and then just transfer all the learnings into the real world. How can we do that? Well, we need some sort of concept of truth. And by the way, we need more than that. We need a concept of truth, so what is a true representation of the reality? And another thing we need is, we need to understand goals. And this is something that I think Musil touches upon, but it's not a central theme, at least not in my opinion, of the man without qualities. Pursuing goals. What is a goal? Or, and I don't mean things like the meaning of life. This is too abstract, and it's not very useful to talk about this, at least not in the context of goals when we talk about AI. But what is useful is, particularly if you're a bitter lesson-pilled person, or if you believe in what Richard Sutton is talking about, and I think he is, in my opinion, the most important AI researcher alive today. It is the pursuit of goals is what defines AI, and by the way, also economic growth. So we're not constrained by compute, we're not constrained by energy, we're constrained by the ability to pursue goals that are useful for us. You know, we can pursue goals like North Korea is pursuing certain goals that they're not very interesting. Soviet Union, Russia is pursuing goals, they're not very interesting. The most interesting societies are those where goals themselves evolve in a sort of evolutionary way and come up, you know, with ideas. The idea of what kind of goals should we even pursue is in itself a very interesting question, and it ties to reality in a sense, or the truth, because even there you can have a goal which is more true than another one. Is it really useful to pursue going to Mars? Musk is making a big deal out of this. In my opinion, it is. It has a tremendous value for society because it inspires a whole generation of kids to study physics and engineering. It creates commercial opportunities for SpaceX. It's a commercial operation, so it's not a government-funded operation, such as, for example, fusion energy, which is much more questionable because anything which is government-funded, anything which is top-down, doesn't have that same quality like when it comes from the bottom up, like, let's say, SpaceX or other goals. You know, even it doesn't have to be just Musk, but let's say the goal of Google to represent all information in a coherent way and things like that, although they unfortunately left the trajectory of truth towards an ideological trajectory, but nevertheless, I think they're doing a good job in many ways, or the pursuit of truth, what companies like Anduril are trying to do, which is basically empower our military forces to the point where we're unpenetrable and invincible, which is the best guarantee for peace. So those are good goals. I think goals, there's good goals and there's bad goals, and the good goals, they have to evolve the same way like good food or good symphonies or good paintings evolve. They have to evolve in an iterative way. They have to evolve from bottom up, and I think that's something that I didn't see too much of that in the novel, but it certainly inspired me to think about this because, and this is a key concept of the novel, once you go beyond good and evil, to paraphrase Nietzsche, once you give up on those, once you give up on clear-cut, left-right, black and white type concepts, you have to come up with something better. And I think the better is a more organic way, a market-driven way, a consensus-driven way. Consensus not in a sort of Anthony Fauci type consensus where if you don't agree with me, you get canceled, but in a real consensus way. So we as a society, as a biological intelligence, evolve through our goals. I think that's, you know, in my opinion, the most important question of the coming decades is how do we evolve and how do we evolve goals? Because the goals that we pursue, they will define our trajectory. Thank you.